Hi everyone, Ryan Adams here. Today I want to show you how we can do a domain independent cluster. There's a few prerequisites that we have to have in place first. One of those is going to be that we need to have an account on both of the nodes. So I have two nodes here, two different servers that we're going to be taking a look at. Now, this can be done a couple of different ways. Domain independent meaning that either both of these servers could be in a work group and not in a domain at all. They could both be in a domain, which would defeat the purpose, but that is possible, right? And then one of them could be in a domain and one of them could not be in a domain. And so that's what I'm going to do today. So if I take a look at this first server here, this guy's called Demo2, and we can see here that he is indeed in a work group. So he's not joined to any domain at all anywhere, totally and completely independent. Now contrasted with that is going to be our other server. So this is server 1, he's called server 1. So we have demo 2 is my first server, and server 1 is my other server. And I can see here that I have, and I'm going to give this a minute to refresh. There we go. Always takes a minute to refresh in Server Manager. So we can see that he is indeed in part of a domain. He is in the Americans.com domain. Fantastic. So that's going to be kind of interesting as we look to take both of these, create a cluster around them. And that's the other interesting thing to note too, is the magic behind being able to do this is really in the Windows side. It's really in the clustering side, not necessarily in the SQL Server side. And I bring that out because we always talk about this, and you tend to see this in a lot of blog posts and documentation out there. And you always see it talk about Windows 16 2016 and SQL Server 2016. Now, the Windows Server 2016, you definitely have to have that. It's going to be a requirement to do this. SQL Server 2016, a lot of the examples and stuff, the reason that you see SQL 2016 is just because that was the version that was current when Windows Server 2016 came out, and we got the capability to do this. This isn't an overly new capability. This has actually been out for a while. Now, I have tested this with SQL Server 2014, so Windows Server 2016 running on SQL 2014 works perfectly fine. I haven't personally tested it any lower than that. I suspect that it'll work with SQL 2012, but I haven't actually tested that myself to tell you that it unequivocally absolutely works. So back to our prerequisites here. This section here, and so we're running this out of PowerShell, is going to create a local user, not a domain user. It's going to be a local user here on my server. And not only is it going to do that, it's going to prompt us for a password and all that kind of good stuff. And I'm going to just name him, you can see here, WSFC is the name that I'm using for this account. And he has to be an administrator. So I'm adding him to two groups. I'm adding him to the regular local users group, and then I'm adding him to the local administrators group. So we'll go ahead and run that. Again, we're here on demo 2. So this is our first server. So we'll go ahead and run that piece. It's going to prompt me for a password. I will put in my user account password, and that went great. So let's go in and look at the next prerequisite. And there's 3 of them, so that's the first one. My second prerequisite is if you're using a local service account, meaning local system, local service, network service, one of those, you can skip this step. You don't need this. If, however, you're using a service account, local or domain, then we need to add a property into the local registry. And this property, if I scroll over here to the right, is called local account token filter policy. And I will put a link into the blog post where you can go look at the details of why we need to do that. But if we're not using a built-in account, we do need to add that DNS entry. So we'll go ahead and run that, and we'll add that entry, and that adds perfectly fine. Now the third part, this is the third prerequisite that you have to do, and we will have to do this on both servers, so we'll flip over to the other server and do it here in a minute, is we need to make sure that we have a primary DNS suffix defined on our server. Now, if you're joined to a domain, and we'll jump over there and I'll show you that server in a minute, part of joining to a domain by default, unless it's unchecked, is we will inherit the primary DNS suffix as the DNS suffix of the domain that we're joining. So if one of these, and in our case it is joined a domain, we don't really need to worry about doing anything with that one. Now, I've obviously commented this out because I've already set the DNS suffix. I'm not going to do it again here, but I wanted to make sure that you guys had the PowerShell code in order to be able to do this in your own environments as an example. So for me, I'm setting a variable here for independent.com, which will be my DNS suffix. Now remember, this server is called demo2, so that would give him a fully qualified domain name of demo2.independent.com. And then I'm going in and I'm setting those properties in the registry. There's two places in the current control set TCP/IP parameters that we need to set. We're going to set the domain and the NV domain to be that value in order to get our primary DNS suffix. Now again, I've already done that on this server. We don't need to do that. What I will do is show you where we find that in the GUI though, for those of you that aren't familiar with doing this, you're not familiar with joining domains and working with domains and that kind of stuff. Now this guy is my work group guy, but I'll show you the dialog box so we can see what he looks like. So I'm just in Server Manager. I clicked Local Server over here on the left. This kind of gives me, this first pane shows me all the details, some really good interesting information about my box. And it's called Work Group right here. So I'll click the hyperlink. Brings this box up. On the Computer Name tab here, we're going to click the Change button. And here's where we could join a domain. And you can clearly see that I'm not a member of a domain. I am indeed a member of a work group right now, and the work group is simply called Work Group that I happen to be joined in. Now, I have a full computer name. Now, by default, if you build a brand new server, you won't get this. It would have just said demo2 here. There would not have been an independent.com on the end of it, but I've already done that piece. So how do I do that? Well, I click this little More button right here. When I click the More button, here's where I define my primary DNS suffix, and you can see that I have added independent.com right here. You'll also notice this box. This box says change primary DNS suffix when the domain membership changes. So if I were to join him to contoso.com domain, it would automatically change this, no longer be independent.com. It would change his DNS suffix to be contoso.com. His FQDN would be demo2.contoso.com. So if you wanted to make sure that this did not change with a domain membership, and you want it to always be independent.com no matter what, maybe you're in a disjointed domain DNS namespace or something to that where you want to remove this checkbox, then you can go ahead and do that. For me, I don't really care in my demo environment as long as I have my independent.com set here. So the reason I left that and didn't actually run the code is if I do that, I've got to reboot the box. So I've given you the code to be able to do that here in PowerShell to set that DNS suffix, and then we would typically have to do a restart after that in order for that change to take effect. But I didn't want to waste time in our demo here today sitting here twiddling our thumbs while we were doing a restart. So I don't actually need to do any of that. So that takes care of those three prerequisites on my first server, which is demo2. Let's switch over here to server 1. Now, server 1, and let me zoom in a little bit more because a little hard to read that probably. So we'll zoom in a bit on that. Maybe close that window. So we'll do the same thing here. Again, I'm creating a new user here called WSFC. The username that you use here and the password you use for this account has to match what you created on the first server. They have to be absolutely identical. So a lot of you will think about pass-through authentication. That's essentially what we're doing here, is we're setting up pass-through authentication. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. We're going to add him to the two groups, right? Local users, local administrators group. Throw our password in, and that will create the account for me. Then we need to do that registry entry. We'll go ahead and run this line to add that key into my registry. Great. Now this is the part where we'd have to do the DNS suffix. This guy's going to look a little bit different though, because if you notice, he's part of a domain. So being part of a domain means that that's automatically going to be his DNS suffix. So let's click on that and see what the dialog box looks like for this guy since he's joined as part of a domain. So we can see here his full computer name is server1.americans.com. The fact that we see Americans.com on there and a fully qualified domain name means that he does indeed have a primary DNS suffix set. And of course, it does indeed match Americans.com. Cool. Let's take a look at the change button. Let's go ahead and hit that. Looking at this dialog box again, we'll see we have server 1 Americans.com, because he is indeed part of a domain down here. This piece, of course, is different. Let's click the More button. Let's see what that dialog box looks like. So I do have my change primary DNS suffix checked, which is checked by default in every OS out of the box, which means that when I joined him to the Americans.com, he automatically got this as my primary DNS suffix. So now that we've done that, and we know that our prerequisites are in place, and everything's set up and good to go, now we can actually create the cluster. Now you can do this out of the GUI. I'm just going to do it right here out of PowerShell. So I'm running the new cluster command. I'm telling it the name that I want my cluster to be. I'm telling it what nodes I want that there to be included, and I'm including server 1 and demo 2 as my two nodes. This part is the part we want to pay attention to. This is the piece that's different from what we normally do. Administrative access point is DNS, as opposed to being a Windows server failover cluster. So we're using DNS as the administrative access point here. That's the piece that changes. I'm giving mine a static IP address for my cluster name. And then for me, the way I have my network set up, I'm actually just ignoring a network and not worrying about storage. We are doing an availability group here, so we don't really need any shared storage. We're going to go ahead and ignore those tests. So let's go ahead and run that to create our cluster. So this is going to go through, do exactly what you do if you were running this out of the GUI. It's going to go through and do cluster validation, check the validation, make sure everything's okay. Then it's going to, it's actually going to look at the validation report, run one if there's not one, and it's going to create the cluster itself. Now this doesn't take very long to run. This runs fairly quickly. But when it's done, we can open up Failover Cluster Manager, and we can take a look at what it looks like and that it's all set up. Now, let me drag this up because I want you to see this. Here's the output, and there's a warning here, and it says, hey, there were issues while creating the clustered role that may prevent it from starting. So that sounds pretty alarming. So it says there's a report file location, which is where we always dump our cluster reports and see Windows cluster reports. Let's just go take a look at it and see what that guy says, figure out what it's complaining about. All right, so we'll go to Windows, Cluster Reports. There's more than one in here, so April 22nd, 2018 at 10:36 a.m. Let's go look at that one. It's this guy right here. Okay, so we'll scroll down, and here's the warning that it's complaining about. It says inappropriate disk was not found for configuring a disk witness. The cluster is not configured with a witness. As a best practice, we suggest for best high availability that you have one. There is no shared storage in order to configure a file share witness or a cloud witness. So we need to configure one of those. I'm not going to do that today. In order to configure a cluster properly, in this particular instance, I have two nodes, which means I'd have an even number, which is not what we want. We want to have an odd number of votes in our cluster. I would need to go create a cloud witness or a file share witness. If I had shared storage, I could also do a disk witness. In this particular instance, I do not have shared storage configured because this is an availability group. So this is really by design. It's just saying, hey, you really didn't get your everything configured quite right. And for our demo test environment today, that's perfectly fine. In production, I would absolutely go create a witness for this. Okay, we can safely ignore that, but you guys may see that, so I wanted to make sure you saw that. So now I'm wondering, hey, what does the cluster look like? Well, let's open up Failover Cluster Manager and just validate ourselves to look at it and just see what this happens to look like. So here's Failover Cluster Manager. We're going to go ahead and connect. So here we are, and we can see it's no domain CLUS for no domain clus, and it's independent.com because we used that DNS namespace as our administrative access point. So I can see I have my the current host server for the cluster is demo2 right here, and here's the name of the cluster. It is called nodomainclus.independent.com. Cool. So that means everything is up and running. Now, of course, I don't have a witness here. That's one thing we know we need to fix later. I can come down here and take a look at the resources. And at this point, I have a name and a couple of IP addresses here. Now I'm using a demo environment that I do other demos in, which is why it's multi-subnet and you see 2 IP addresses here. And this is technically not even configured correct for that, but that is just the replicant of the fact that I happen to be in a test environment here. But my domain is, or my cluster here, looks fine. Now I don't have any roles, I haven't done anything for it, but I can see my nodes in here. Here's demo 2, right? We can see some of his information down here. Here's server 1. So we've successfully created a Windows failover cluster between these two nodes, one of which is not in a domain at all. He's in a work group, one of which is in a domain. So that's pretty cool. So now, in order to really complete our configuration, once we've got that part in play, now we just need to look at what do we do to create the availability group on top of this. So let's go take a look at that piece. Now, in order to do this, what we need to do is we need to create certificates. And I'm going to put a blog post in there for you, and it's going to be this link right here. This is written by one of our Microsoft program group guys. Kevin Farley wrote this. So this is where I borrowed this code from. So I will put a link in there to make sure that you've got it and include all of this code and stuff for you. What we're doing here is before we create our availability group, we need to create the endpoints. But the endpoints are going to be a little bit different because we don't have a security authority sitting in between these two guys to broker that. If they were both in a domain, then we would have a computer object that would get created in the domain, and that would be where all of our security context was working within that computer object. But we don't have that security context. We don't have a domain sitting here being able to handle authorization and authentication in the middle for us at this point. So in order for us to have those endpoints, which is my communication channel between my nodes and replicas in an availability group, we need to secure those using some other method. And the method we're going to use to do that is certificates. So what we're going to do now is we're going to create a certificate here on this server, which is demo2. This code is going to create a procedure a stored proc that will do that for us. And this stored proc will do a couple of things. It does 3 different things. It creates a certificate for us. Once it creates the certificate, it's going to create the endpoint for us and secure that endpoint using that certificate. And the last thing it's going to do is it's going to back this up to a file share. And the file share happens to be ctemp right here on this server, and this folder has been shared out. The reason we're backing the cert up here is in order for this authentication piece to work is if I've secured this endpoint on demo 2 with this certificate, that means that server 1 over here, my other box, needs to have that certificate installed in order to access and use the endpoint here on demo 2. So we're doing this from both directions, right? Creating the cert and the endpoint here on demo 2. We're going to go create a cert and endpoint on server 1 and back those certs up. And then we'll take the cert from server 1. We're going to install and import him into demo 2. We're going to take the cert from demo 2 and we're going to install and import that into server 1. So let's walk through that. No certs in here, just a bunch of backups and databases and junk from other demos and tests here in my environment. So let's run this stored proc. Again, I'll give you the link in order to go use this stored proc yourself. So we'll run this just to create the procedure. Then we'll run it. And so I'm going to execute this, create endpoint. And what I'm doing is I'm throwing two parameters. This first parameter says, hey, when I back up that certificate, what file share should I put it at? Here's my file share, right? Demo2 temp. And what password do you want to use for the certificate? Cool. So let's go ahead and run that. So three things have just happened here. We went and created the certificate. We've created the endpoint, and we can see all of this stuff, right? I can go under databases, system databases. If I look under master security and certificates, I'll refresh this. And there is my demo2 cert right there, right? So we can see that the cert has been successfully created here. Awesome. That was step one that it did for us. It also said it created an endpoint, so let's go look at that. So we're going to server objects, endpoints, database mirroring. Let's refresh this. And there we are. There's my endpoint. It's called always on underscore EP for endpoint. Cool. So my endpoint is created. Now, it was also supposed to back it up, right? So let's go look in the file share and make sure that it actually backed it up. Sure enough, here's my certificate backed up to my local system. That's awesome. So now we need to go do that exact same thing on the other server. So let's go do that. And we'll go here to Management Studio. Okay, exact same store procedure. We're just going to go ahead and run this to create it. And then we'll run this line in order to give it the path to back it up to and the password that we want to use for our certificate. And we'll verify all that stuff here. So databases, system, master, security, certificates, refresh this folder. And sure enough, I see that I have my server one -cert sitting here. All right, that went as planned. Let's make sure that our endpoint showed up. Let's refresh here, expand it, and there is our always on EP endpoint. He's also been created as well. If I go back over to the file share, which is back here on the other server, there is SQL Server -server one certificate. So that's great. Everything went according to plan now that we've created our endpoints. But they really can't access each other quite yet because Demo2 needs server 1 cert and server 1 needs Demo2 certs. Let's look at that. So another store procedure, link is the same. I'll give you that as well. And what this store procedure is going to do is he's going to go through and basically grab that certificate and add that to the server. He's going to do the install for us. He's also going to come down here, last thing, he's going to grant connect on the endpoint to that certificate. All right, so we'll go ahead and run this just to create the procedure, and then we'll execute it. Now, I have two execution lines, one depending upon which server I happen to be on. And let's take a look at the parameters that we're using here. So this first parameter is the name of the server that you want to install its certificate. So if I'm on demo 2, I want to install server 1 certificate, so I'm going to use this first line that I'm on right now. And let's increase that size just to make sure that we can all see that. And then it says, well, where's it at, right? So here's the file share that we backed it up to. That's where it's going to go grab it from. And then, of course, our password for it. So let's go ahead and run that. And that ran fine. So that's going to install our certificate for us. And we can go over here and verify that again as well. Going back under certificates, we'll go ahead and refresh. And then sure enough, oh, my tooltip's still there. Sure enough, there he is. Now I have server 1 cert installed here as well. Let's go do that exact same procedure over here on this guy on server 1. Okay, run this to create the procedure. I'm going to run the other line I want to. I'm on server 1, so I'm installing the demo 2 cert here. Right, so you can see here, this is demo 2. And then of course, we see this, our URL share, and then of course our password. So let's go ahead and run that. All right, that ran perfectly successful, so that's all good. So now at this point, now that the endpoints are there, we've kind of set the stage in order to create our availability group because our communication channel there exists now. So the last thing we really need to do here, we just need to go create the availability group. So let's kind of walk through that. And again, I'll provide all of this code for you. I'm just going to give you the high level highlights here as we kind of walk through this. So I'm using SQL command mode here to connect to demo 2. And what I'm doing is I'm going to take the always on health extended event session. It's there on every server by default, even if you have not enabled always on availability groups. I'm going to start it and turn it on, and I'm going to set it so that the state is going to continue to start from here on forward. I'm going to do that on demo 2. And then this section is going to do it on demo or on server 1. So we're running that exact same procedure on both just to make sure I have my extended event sessions running. Great, so that part has been done. So now what we need to do, connect to our primary replica. I'm going to use trace flag 9567. So I'm going to use direct seeding for this database. What this is going to do is enable compression during the seeding process. If you're not familiar with seeding and you're still using the older method of backing it up and doing restores yourself, and there are some cases with larger databases where you would still want to do that in order to make it faster and efficient. But if that's not the case, direct seeding is extremely efficient and very quick at automatically taking your databases from your primary and making sure that those exist. So definitely go take a look at that, go do a search on that, do some reading on seeding if you're not familiar with it. And then I'm going to run through it. I'm going to create my availability group. And there's really nothing special that I'm using in the code here, right? Create availability group. I'm going to call it my AG. I'm just setting some backup on this line. I'm setting some backup preferences here. Failure condition levels, health check timeout, database level failover. I'm not using any DTC support here. I'm only adding one database, so it's just for database called domain independent. So we can look at that. If we come over here, we'll expand. Let's close our system databases. I'll refresh just to make sure we're looking at a current view. And here's our domain independent. So I don't see anything in parentheses next to him. Typically, I would see a synchronized status here. So just to prove that he's not in an availability group now, he's just a regular independent database. And then over here on this node, if I look under databases and I refresh here, you'll notice that there are no databases listed here at all, not a one. Right? Obviously my system databases are here, master model MSDB, but as far as user databases, hitting refresh here, you'll see the database does not exist at all. Defining my endpoints here, or my endpoint URL, right? And so you'll notice that my URL is different here, right? Because remember, I'm using something that's disjointed here. They're not in the same domain. The primary DNS suffix is different. Demo 2 is in the independent.com DNS namespace. Server 1 is not. So make sure when you put your URL in here that you're using the correct URL. These are going to be, in our instance, different. Now, they might not be. I might have two servers that are in work groups. Neither one of them are joined to a domain, and they could both be in the same primary DNS suffix. So just make sure that you're getting those right. But for me, they're different because I am in different DNS namespaces. Right? I'm setting my synchronous mode, backup availabilities. What do I want? What role is it in secondary? And then, of course, this piece for using seeding here at the end, seeding mode being automatic. And then I'm going to go ahead and create a listener here as well, and I'm just giving it a static IP address in my local Class A non-routable range of the 10.000 range. So let's go ahead and run that. And this is going to connect to demo 2 to create the availability group and create the listener. Now, although it's created the availability group, remember the availability group itself is really just a remnant, or it's not a remnant, it would be a logical construct to hold all of the other pieces, right? So we've created the shell, but now we need to add the other pieces here. Now, we kind of got some nastiness going on down here. We've got this error message that, is red. That's never good, right? So it says, an attempt to fail over create this availability group failed. This operation is not supported when an always-on availability groups is running under a remote Windows server failover clustering cluster context. Under a remote server cluster context, failing over creating availability group is not supported. So that message actually tells me nothing about what the problem is. And the problem is, and this is just because I'm in a demo environment, this is probably not going to happen to you, but if you have a cluster and you have an availability group on it, and then you destroy it, destroying the availability group is okay, and you can recreate it, no problem. But once you destroy the cluster, there is a relationship between SQL Server and the cluster, and that's stored in the cluster. Once you do that, and the cluster is gone, that relationship, and it's stored as a GUID value, is now gone and destroyed. Which means that we need to recreate that relationship. So in order to do that, we actually need to go into Configuration Manager. I'm going to go into SQL Server, and I'm actually going to disable availability groups. I'm going to turn it off. Tell it yes, okay. It says, yeah, we need to be restarted, all that kind of good stuff. I am going to have to do that on both servers. So let me come over here to this guy. I'm going to need to do the same thing on server 1. Go into our always on high availability tab. We're going to turn it off. So yes, we do have to stop and restart it. That's fine by me. And then click OK. Now we'll go back and we need to turn it back on. Funny thing is, when you turn it off and it says, hey, by the way, we need to stop and restart the service to do that, it actually stops and restarts the service for you. But when we come back over here and we want to go turn it back on, although it gives us this warning, and we'll see it here in a second. Let's see if this guy's ready. I turn it back on. I tell it okay. It says, yeah, so any changes will be saved, but they're not going to take effect until the service gets stopped and restarted. Well, it doesn't actually stop and restart it for you. You need to do that. So we'll go ahead and restart the service there. Go back over to demo 2. We'll do the same thing here. Turn it on, tell it okay. Our restart warning. And then we will go ahead and restart the service. So I can see my window here, they're both still restarting. That guy's done. This guy is stopping, and then he'll restart. Now, once he comes back up and he gets started again, we'll be able to go ahead, go in and recreate and run our availability group again. So he's starting back up, getting SQL Server back up and running. Done here in just a second. And then we will go run this same line of code again. And then hopefully we won't have an error again. It is interesting though. And again, you might want to make a note of this, right? I mean, if you look at this, an attempt to failover create an availability group failed. This operation's not supported when always on availability groups is running under a remote Windows Server failover clustering cluster context. Really confusing error message. This really doesn't indicate at all what this problem was. And obviously I ran into this problem intentionally because I wanted you guys to see this, because somebody else is going to run into it, right? You're going to go out there and you're going to play with this, and you're probably going to test this in your own test environment before you do it in production, because I told you to. Go test it before you do anything in production to make sure you have all your ducks in order and everything works the way that you expect it. You may run across this error if you're destroying and recreating your cluster, so somebody's probably going to run across it. So executing again, and now we have some success. Oh, and by the way, you can actually do this with PowerShell. The whole stopping and restarting, turning the SQL, the always on availability groups on and back off, super easy to write in PowerShell. In fact, I will include that just so you guys have that. You'll find that here in the blog post along with this video. That way you guys have access to it in case you need to use it. I will put that in there. That way you've kind of got some example code to work with and do that if need be. Now, the availability group exists at this point, but again, it's just that shell. We really haven't completed all the pieces just yet. So I'm going to connect over to server 1. You'll notice that I'm using SQL command mode, because I'm here on demo 2, in order to connect to both servers, but I'm defining a username and password here, right? So I'm using SQL authentication. I can't use Windows authentication in this instance. Why? Well, because one of them is in a work group. Again, that domain. So as soon as we take the domain out of things, from a security perspective, there are a few other things we kind of have to think about and take into effect that, hey, Windows auth's not going to work for me here, right? So I'm going to alter the availability group here on server 1 and basically join it. So we're joining the replica to the availability group. We're also going to give it this permission, grant create any database. So this is required for seeding, if you're going to use seeding, right? Because you'll notice that I'm not backing up my database to a share. I'm not restoring it with no recovery and walking through those steps. In fact, I showed you a minute ago, the database on server 1 doesn't even exist at all. It's not even there. So let's go ahead and run this. All right, that was successful. At this point, we're done. I have some additional code. I'm going to give this all to you. This piece here, now my database is super small, right? I've got one table in this database. There's pretty much nothing in it. So it's pretty much instantaneous. This is going to pull from sysdmhadr automatic seeding. And we're doing this. I'm going to show you that. And then there's a second query we're going to pull from HADR physical seeding stats. If you've got a database that's large and takes a little while in order to copy it all over, this will let me get a status. So if I run this, let's look at our results a little bit bigger where we can see those. I'll zoom in a little bit here. So I can see, hey, here's the name of the availability group. Here's the name of the database. If there was more than one database in this AG, I'd see more than one line here, be more than one result set. The current state is it's completed, right? It's done. If I scroll over a little bit more, it did perform seeding. And of course, there were no failures. Everything was perfectly successful here. The bottom part gives me a little bit more detailed information about, here's my local ID, there's the remote ID, what's the database ID, local database name, what was the URL. So we get a little bit more information in this bottom piece here as well. And there's some interesting information here, and I'm not going to walk through this. This will be an exercise for you to do on your own time, but it's cool to be able to see some of these numbers, right? Here's the transfer rate, bytes per second. Here's how many bytes is transferred so far. Here's what the database size was in bytes. Here was the start time and the end time, right? So there's some good information to look at. So I wanted you guys to have that just so that if you're using seeding, you'll be able to look at it. Little example of, hey, prior to 2016, which is when we added seeding in the product, here is what we would have had to have done in order to join the AG. But of course, we're not doing that here. And then I'm just going to go ahead and turn my trace flag off because I've got that compression trace flag running. So let's verify that it did exactly what I wanted it to do. Let me refresh databases here. And taking a closer look at domain independent, sure enough, I can now see that he is synchronized and in a synchronized state. That's looking good. Let's look at the availability groups. Here's my AG. I can see I have a listener. The databases, there's domain independent, and then here's my two replicas, right? One of these This guy in a work group. This guy joined to a domain. That's pretty cool. Hey, let's look at the dashboard. Let's hope we get to see our sea of green. Everything should be green and good. And it is, right? Everything here is green. I am in a healthy state. It's telling me that the current primary instance is demo 2, right? My failover mode's automatic. Cluster state, this is a little bit different. It's normal quorum, right? Of course, I should be going back and fixing that. I should have a witness. We talked about we needed to add that. And then the cluster type is Windows Server failover cluster. So I'll be doing another video and blog post on how do we do this without a cluster at all. What if I don't want to do a cluster? There may be firewall issues and things between servers would be a reason that I might not want a cluster. Maybe I want to create what we call a read scale out availability group in order to scale out and increase my reads. So there are reasons where we may not want to have a cluster at all, and I'll show you how we can create an availability group in another video without a cluster. And we'll see in that video that this cluster type will not be Windows Server failover cluster, it'll be none. And then let's take a look at availability routes. So we can see here's my 2 replicas, right? Demo 1 is here, server 1 is here. They're in a good state. And then of course, here's the state of the database on each of those. So everything looks absolutely perfect, exactly the way that I wanted it. And so that's how we would go through and we would create a cluster that is domain independent or a domainless cluster, right? So here, I'm calling this domain independent because one of them is independent of the domain and another node is not. It's in a domain. These both could have been in a work group. Wouldn't have made a difference. This process would have been exactly the same had both of these been in a work group and not in a domain at all. They also could have both been joined to different domains, right? I had server 1 joined to Americans.com. I could have created, say, Contoso.com, joined demo 2 to Contoso.com. Everything we did here would have been exactly the same. Again, this is a Windows thing. You can do this. I'm running SQL. Actually, I'm not sure what version I'm running. Let's find out. I think I'm running 2016 here. Let's find out. So I'm actually running 2017 here. I have tested this with SQL Server 2016, which is actually when it got this capability was released. Then, when it was released in Windows Server 2016, which is when SQL 2016 was available. I have tested this in 2017, 2016, and 2014. And this works in all versions of those 3 different versions of SQL Server. For sure, I've tested those. I am guessing that it works in 2012 as well. I just haven't tested that. The magic here is not SQL. The magic is Windows. This is a clustering thing. It's a Windows thing. You do need to be running Windows Server 2016 in order for this capability to work. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. I hope it's useful for you. If you have any questions, feel free in the blog post to go down in the comments, throw some questions down there. You can hit me up on Twitter at Ryan J. Adams is my handle on Twitter. Feel free to do that if you have any questions over this. But I've hoped that this was good enough to help walk you through and show you a good demo scenario of how we would do this, how we would implement this, and the different ways that it could be done. And of course, in the blog post, if you happen to find this video on YouTube, there'll be a link there in the video back to the blog post where you can grab all the code. I'll host all the code in the post itself. That way you will have all of this available to you. You can set up and play with it in your own demo environment, make any adjustments and changes that you need, and this will help get you a good jump start on going production with this. If you're looking at doing a production environment, it'll be a great way to test it out and play with it and make sure you get everything set up for your specifics and your specific environment to be able to do that. So thank you guys for joining and listening to me today, and we will talk to you soon on another video and another blog post.